Well, good evening and welcome to the discussion. Given the current economic circumstances, it is important to set the stage for a discourse on economic revival and re-engineering, changing the role of the state, developing human capital, unleashing competitiveness, and be future ready. Unshackling India, Hard Truths and Clear Choices for Economic Revival by Dr. Ajay Chiber and Mr. Salman Anis Soos does exactly that. Books analyzing contemporary Indian economic problems invariably find fault with governments in having meddled a bit too much in certain matters or not having done enough in others. There are two broad narratives. One, that government policies have stifled private initiatives. The other, government has failed on public investment front. Authors have a great deal of faith in the potential of the Indian economy, despite a very incisive critique of the economy and its long-standing, deep-rooted problems in areas like agriculture, industry, and even the services sector. Easy to find the government, the private sector, the public sector, the banks guilty, but difficult to provide an alternative, which the book does. Authors are upbeat about the possibilities that climate change and transition to a low carbon economy might provide for the Indian economy. New technologies, new ways of manufacturing, new job opportunities, and also to get rid of some of the hangovers of the past. It is in this backdrop, today we discuss the Indian economy by 2047 and how to make it happen, whether it is pursuing the next generation reforms, reducing the scope and reach of the state, or re-engineering for inclusive growth, and so on. The focus is on drawing recommendations so that these can be shared with the relevant stakeholders, including the Ministry of Finance. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel today. Dr. Ajay Chiber, author and distinguished visiting scholar, Institute for International Economic Policy, George Washington University. He was visiting professor at NIPFP and India's first Director General of Independent Evaluation with the status of Minister of State. He was UN Assistant Secretary General, Assistant Administrator at UNDP, and served as the World Bank's Country Director in Turkey and Vietnam, and led the 1997 World Development Report on the role of the state. Mr. Salman Soos is an author, economist, and a commentator. Worked on economic development issues on Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Middle East, and the North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. He serves as a consultant to multiple World Bank teams and was previously a consultant at the ADB. Ms. Mahua Mukherjee is Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, completed a career at the World Bank where she led policy dialogue and diverse public sector investment projects in 44 different countries, of which most were energy projects in the last 15 years. Moved back to India in 2017 and served as Program Ambassador for 2.5 years at the International Solar Alliance. Mr. Alok Ranjan, former Chief Secretary, Uttar Pradesh. During his 38 years of distinguished public service, he provided leadership and worked in a variety of sectors concerned with economics, finance, and industrial governance. Author of 3 books and a regular contributor to Times of India, Economic Times, and Business Standard, he writes a fortnightly column in Economic Times, The Pioneer, and The Millennium Post. Our moderator for today's show, Dr. Ajit Ranade, Vice Chancellor, Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, was earlier Executive President and Chief Economist, Aditya Birla Group, and Executive Officer of Financial Technologies India Limited and Chief Economist at ABN AMRO Bank. His professional career has spanned academic and corporate assignments, including teaching in universities in India as well as the United States. Dr. Nisha Agarwal, economist and former CEO of Oxfam India. She has worked on poverty, inequality, and social development issues for more than 30 years. While being at Oxfam's work on the most lagging states and the most marginalized groups. When at World Bank, she worked in South Asia and East Asia and East African region for nearly 20 years. Her latest book, Her Right to Equality, From Promise to Power, was published in 2021. Dr. Shekhar Bonu is Director General, Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office, Niti Aayog. He is fulfilling the monitoring and evaluation mandates assigned to the Niti Aayog. He was earlier with ADB in Manila for 15 years and worked in health, urban infrastructure development, and regional cooperation, mainly in South Asia. Ms. Pooja Mehra, author and economic journalist with a career spanning over 17 years. She has covered key contemporary Indian economic developments. She has recently authored the book, The Lost Decade, 2008-18, How India's Growth Story Devolved into Growth Without a Story. She won the prestigious Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award in 2008 and 2009. And Mr. Sameer Kochar, Chairman SKOCH Group and author of Modenomics. Welcome, gentlemen and ladies, once again. And with this, I hand over to our moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Gurushanan. And I'm privileged, delighted, honored to be moderating this panel. We have an excellent lineup of speakers. And of course, we are here to celebrate and discuss and cogitate on this book called Unshackling India. One of the questions I always like to ask, but I'll ask it later, is who shackled India? When did it become shackled? So we want to unshackle it. The proposed program is as follows, that we will have the authors, Dr. Ajay Chiber and Dr. Salman Soz, talk about the book for the first maybe 8 or 10 minutes. And then we have the panelists who will give us their initial remarks on the book. I'll tell you the sequence. Ms. Nisha Agarwal, followed by Mr. Shekhar Bonu, followed by Ms. Mahua Mukherjee, followed by Mr. Alok Ranjan, and followed by Ms. Pooja Mehra. So requesting the panelists who will give their remarks to restrict their remarks or comments to maybe 7 minutes so that we have enough time for a conversation, a discussion, a critique, and some questions later. So as a moderator, I'm tempted to use my time to make some general remarks, but I think I'll come back later. I've read the book and it's it's a delightful read. It's an easy read. Difficult for economists to write books which have a lot of data and sometimes even graphs which don't make sense to non-economists or non-mathematicians, and these tables, these numbers, just make, it sounds like a maze, but I think the authors have cleverly put together something which is readable and yet has a lot of data and based on rigorous data. So my compliments to the authors, but we'll talk more about the book as we discuss it. So I will now hand over to the authors, Mr. Chiber and Mr. Soz.
Well, thank you very much, Ajit, and thank you, Dr. Gurushanan, for the very kind introduction, and to Sameer and Rohan, thank you so much to SKOCH for featuring our book in this format. We are very delighted to be here. Just, we are here more to listen, but just very briefly to introduce a little bit the book. You wouldn't believe it, but while Salman and I are from the same college and we went to the World Bank, we only met each other like 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, and we found that we liked each other's views. And then came the pandemic, and we realized that all the problems we had talked about were now actually exacerbated and exposed by the pandemic, the problems that India was facing even before the crisis. So then we decided to write the book, and we thought there were two perspectives we could bring, because both of us had worked in many parts of the world. And whenever we went back to India, which we often did, and we all both worked in India as well, what we discovered was that whatever solutions others had come up with, whenever we suggested those to people in India, the reaction always was, well, this is never going to work in India. India is very different. India is sui generis, And I would I shouldn't say this, but particularly among the bureaucracy, you would get this reaction. But it was wider than that. And we said, well, we realized, well, India is of course very different. India's history is different, culture is different, you know, the whole background is different. But Indians react the same way as the rest of the world does to various incentives, various regulations. And Indians do so well once they leave India. So, and then willy-nilly, we would find that India would come back to just those same solutions. So we said we must benchmark India, not just what India has done over the last 75 years, which we tried to do in the book, but also what has the rest of the world done and where do we stand relative to it. So that was one factor that the book brings about. The other thing was that so this is not a political book, although Salman, as he will admit, has a political background. We said, you know, the problems that we have are not sort of due to any one party. I mean, we've had these problems for quite some time. So it's not a book that's sort of focusing on, you know, any one particular, trying to lay the blame on one party. And the solutions also have to be kind of found collectively going forward. So we said, what is missing at the moment is that, you know, you had a major reform in 91 where you had a team that had a very good idea of how things came together and then pressed certain buttons to move India forward from that point on. And it wasn't just the Dr. Manmohan Singh government. I think the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government also took it on subsequently. But at the moment, while there are efforts to try to reform, it's very piecemeal. You know, nobody has a complete picture of what are the state of problems and where does India need to go in the next 25 years. So that's the kind of book we try to write, which is how do things hang together? Why do we have certain outcomes? And I'll pick up 2 points and then pass it on to Salman quickly. One, we felt that despite the fact that India had liberalized, the role of the state was still very omnipresent. And that's where the title, Ajit, Unshackling, comes from, that the heavy hand of the state is still very evident in India. The state its size may not be very large, and we give figures on that also, but the scope, the way it gets into things, into almost everything, is still very, very huge. So one big solution we suggest is to refocus the state to do those. And the state also does a few things well, like maybe it can run an election, has a reasonably competent reserve bank, but it can't deliver basic health and education. So we sort of unpack all that in this book and ask the question, how do we focus the state back towards doing those and even on defense, by the way, we try and show that actually real defense spending in India, despite the threats we face, is one of the lowest over the last 50 years as a share of GDP. So we have to refocus the state, and especially with climate change, we have to refocus it much more in that direction. And the other thing is it's very top heavy. I mean, it's very centralized. And as we show in the book, that in China, in a totally authoritarian state, 50% of spending is not done at the central or even the provincial level, it's done at the local level. And in India, that number is close to 4% of GDP. So anyway, that's one big area we try and unpack. And the other is, why has this system created so few jobs? And there we link it up with a number of things. It's not a one solution sort of answer there we give, but a combination of things that we lay out in terms of labor laws, how badly we've managed the banking sector, and how we use our most abundant factor of production, labor, so badly, and the most the least available factor of production, land, also so poorly that we use. So we try and unpack all that in this book. But let me stop here and just pass it on to Salman, if you don't mind, Ajit.
Sure.
Thank you, Ajay. Well, first, let me thank the SKOCH group. Let me thank both Samir and Rohan and Dr. Danyal. This is not, I know this kind of an event takes a lot of planning, and I know you've been in touch with us for a few months now to make this happen. So I really appreciate it. And I also thank all of our fellow panelists who are here, taking a little bit of time from your, I'm sure, busy schedules to be with us. Now, as Ajay said, we conceived of this book literally as the pandemic hit. Actually, we were on a golf course and we started talking about how we should now finally write, because we've been discussing these issues for a long time. But this book is not about the pandemic. This book is not about any one crisis, because India faces multiple crises. And I think that's where we get to this issue of hard truths. So I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the hard truths. Then we can talk later about the clear choices. And we have in our book laid out things that we think India could be doing to deal with the hard truths. So what are the crises that India faces? India faces an inequality crisis. In the last 40 years, the share of the top 1%, the share of income of the top 1% has tripled. In the same time period, the bottom half have seen their share of the income go down by half. That tells us that we're now headed towards being a Brazil. And Latin America was very famous or infamous for income and wealth inequality. India's literally in Brazil territory. Thankfully, not at South Africa levels right now, but we've got to change something. India has an education crisis, has had an education crisis for a while. The World Development Report of 2018 talks about reading scores for second graders. They 80% cannot read, more than 80% cannot read basic text. That puts us in the ranks of Malawi, behind Uganda. So we have an education crisis. We have to come to terms with it. We have a health crisis. We've had a health crisis for a long time. The issues that we're talking about are not new. This is not one government's problem. We've had these problems for a while. We just are not addressing them. In fact, we're making things worse. We have stunting levels at 40%. That means your brain development for 40% of your children is not going to be sufficient to deal with, to have, to be productive citizens in the future. So why should we be constantly surprised that our kids are not employable? Because 40% of them have deficiencies starting from the womb, not even when they're born. It's before that. So, but we don't talk about it. Our discourse is just not about that. We have a crisis of female participation in our labor force. Until recently, before the pandemic, our labor force participation rate for women was about 20%. That put us, at par with countries like Pakistan. But after the pandemic hit, I think we're closer to 10, 12%. And some states in India, like Bihar, are at less than 5%. Women are not working. How can you compete with China? China's at 60%. Nobody talks about this stuff. I'm surprised. When people say that we're going to compete with China, we're an emerging global power. You cannot do it without women. Purely, it's very simple for me. You cannot do it without women, and our women are not participating. That's a huge crisis for us. You all know about manufacturing, and we all talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and we're not keeping up. As Danny Roderick said a long time back, we have premature deindustrialization. You're aware of it, but we can't just talk about these things. We have to, our technology adoption has to be much better than where it is right now. Just as an example, between 2015 and 2019, China registered 500,000 electric vehicles. In the same time period, India registered a few hundred. How can you say that we're going to compete against China? We're not in that league. We're in a totally different league. R&D expenditures. You talk about a K-shaped curve. When people talk about there's a K-shaped recovery curve, I talk about a K-shaped curve in R&D. China's going up, India's stagnating and going down. And in this economy, you cannot compete without R&D, okay? We also have a crisis of institutions and when it comes to things like dealing with the pandemic. Natural disasters are going to be a bigger part of our life. We know it, we've seen it, right? But we're just not prepared. When the pandemic hit, Korea was rolling out a major national testing plan. India was looking for state-level epidemiologists. 11 states in India had no state-level epidemiologists. We were searching for epidemiologists in the middle of a pandemic. Our National Disaster Management Authority does not have an executive head. Hasn't had an executive head for 7 years. There are 4 members. Nobody talks about it. I don't know what we're talking about, but we're not talking about the real issues. And then, of course, there is the crisis of polarization, which we're all familiar with. And no country in the world is going to be able to have a healthy economy when you have such an unhealthy political discourse. So what is to be done? There are lots of things to be done, and our book lays out certain areas, and of course we can get into that. But we do believe, despite all that, despite all this grim talk, we do believe, and that's why we wrote this book, that India can get to upper middle income status within the next 25 years, which is about $3,500 to $4,000 per capita. Can, but we need to talk about, we must first acknowledge these hard truths, because there are many choices that are easy to make, and then there are some difficult choices. But we can do it. We just have to talk about it. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Happy to discuss it further.
Thank you to the authors, Mr. Ajay and Salman. Obviously, you can't condense the entire book in 7-8 minutes, but thank you for giving us the broad contours. So we will go to the panelists for their initial remarks on the book. And you may choose to focus on a chapter or some part of the book or overall impressions. So first we go with Nisha Agarwal.
Thank you so much. I would like to start by congratulating the authors, Ajay Chiber and Salman Soz, for such a comprehensive book. The part that I really liked actually was the chapter 1, the beginning of the book, where they lay out a very appealing vision for what India should look like in 25 years and ask these questions of how we are going to get there. And saying very clearly, which is rare for economists, that it's not just GDP target numbers, whether it's a 5 trillion economy or a 10 trillion economy, that will give us the kind of India that we want to see in 2047, 100 years after independence, but saying that we really need to really fundamentally reshape the economy and society to give us a more inclusive India and one with dignity and trust amongst all its citizens. So I would like to pick up on these 2 themes and build on what Salman said. One about inequality. You know, India before the pandemic was already one of the most unequal countries in the world. Now, by some accounts, we are the 2nd most unequal country in the world. And we, not just India, but the whole world is going through this K-shaped recovery where, you know, 230 million people who fell into poverty. It's estimated that the lower part will take much longer to get back to pre-pandemic levels than the top part. In fact, the top part, the very rich, haven't done so badly, which is why it's K-shaped. During this pandemic, when we, you know, with all the horrific images of what we have in mind, Oxfam has written this report called Inequality Kills. Instead of from 102 billionaires, dollar billionaires that we're talking about in 2020, the number rose almost 40%. It's 142 billionaires in just 1 year. And if you take the 2nd richest man of India, Mr. Adani, his wealth went up almost from 8.9 billion, almost tenfold to $82 billion in 1 year. So, you know, it's not that the book, I think, deals very well with the bottom half to talk about social security systems and REGA, health, education, but it has completely ignored what we need to do to the top half, and how to redistribute that wealth so that we can actually do more for the bottom half. And there I would like to say that what we need to be doing, I think we are going backwards in all of those areas. And we were asked to focus on what can be done and not just analyze the problems. But there are really basically one thing that we need to do, which is to tax the rich. And there are 4 types of taxes that we need to put in India. And in all of these areas, I think we're going backwards rather than forwards. One is the wealth tax, which we've abolished, which we need to reinstate. Second, an inheritance tax that we have re-abolished. And these taxes are very common in other countries. And given the levels of technology that we have, they should be easy to implement. They were kind of abolished, saying they're too hard, the admin cost is not worth it. But now we are linked in 10 different IDs to everything we consume and everything we own. So I don't know why it's so hard for us to do that. The corporate tax rate again, which went backwards. We went down from 30% to 20%. And globally now the G20 has agreed to something even lower, which is around 15%. We think Oxfam thinks it's a very bad idea and it should be something around 25-30%. If individuals can pay that rate, why not the corporate world? And fourthly, eliminating tax loopholes and evasion. When the Pandora Papers came out, there's a large number of very rich Indians who are parking their wealth overseas. And that wealth is not being put to any use, either in the form of taxes or in generating jobs or generating GDP or anything for the country. So I think these are the 4 areas that we really need to work on. There is a group called Millionaires for Humanity, which consists of billionaires who basically wrote a letter during the pandemic saying things are so bad, we need more resources, and saying today we, the undersigned millionaires, ask our governments to raise taxes on people like us immediately, substantially, and permanently. And they'll end the letter by saying tax us, tax us, tax us. Unfortunately, in the 50 millionaires who signed that letter, there's not a single one from India. So this conversation, Piketty was here a few years ago. He tried to say we need to tax the rich more, and it really somehow seems to fall on deaf ears, as if the resources will magically appear from somewhere else to fund our severely underfunded health systems, education systems, and social security system. The second point I want to make is on gender issues. I think the book does a good job in chapter 7 to talk about the fall, and Salman also mentioned it, the decline in labor force participation rates, which is very dramatic and puts us with a handful of very low income countries. But women are invisible in India, not just from the labor force, but from any kind of policy making. If you mentioned the book that I had edited, basically after looking at all aspects of gender, we are saying that instead of the 50% equality that our constitution promised us 70 years ago, we command about 10 to 15% of resources in this country. And what the projection is that nothing is really going to change, and equality is going to take 100 years or more, at the current rates. And unless we do something very dramatic, we're not going to see a vision of inclusion in 25 years. We're just not on track for that. And what do we need to do? Again, I would like to focus on 4 things. One, we are invisible politically. After 70 years, we now have about 10 to 15 in parliament and in the state legislative assemblies. So we need to pass the Women Reservation Bill and give women a voice in policy making, in decision making. Secondly, we are completely invisible in the corporate world. It does even worse than the political world. CEOs are 4 to 5, women CEOs are 4 to 5% of CEOs of the largest companies. The government mandated only 1 woman on every board. The corporate sector is even failing to do that. Again, compared to say 25 to 30%, where the rest of the world is, we are at 10 to 15% on board seats, way behind global averages. Countries are now beginning to mandate equality on boards because there's plenty of evidence that breaking up the old boys network leads to better governance. We haven't done that. Putting 1 woman on a board is a recipe for disaster. You need a critical mass to make a difference. So we need a new laws by SEBI, by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, to actually say that 33 to 50% of board seats should be for women. Third, of course, a very, very important point that the book has emphasized, which is improving the labor force participation rates of women. Most of this decline has come for women in rural areas. And there are 2 things that need to be tackled for that. One, of course, is labor-intensive manufacturing. We really need to grab the stuff moving out of China, which Vietnam and Bangladesh have done very well, as the book points out. But it is really rural women, and there are huge constraints to mobility for women in India. And so somehow we have to think of the China model of rural industrialization and how to get that going. And second is dealing with the social norms that prevent women from working. And the main one there is really that they have the burden of childcare and home care. Yes, I'll stop in a second. And for that, you know, if you look at what is happening, I mean, these Anganwadi workers who run the bulk of the system at the frontline level are on strike today because their work is not even recognized as work, and it's considered voluntary, and they're just paid an honorarium instead of wages. And they've been on strike for a month, and, you know, government announces various wages and without really even consulting them. And they say, who on earth doesn't talk to people who've been on strike for a whole month without consulting them? You just make these announcements. So I think talking, participation, getting women to participate, and unshackling women, I think, is the way to unshackle India. Thank you. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I said that you focused on inequality and gender and suggested specific actions. If there's one thing that can be said about Nisha Agarwal, if there's one thing that can't be said about Nisha Agarwal, is that she's not forceful enough. So thank you for your message was very loud and clear. We're going to move on. I'm going to request the panelists to try and see the clock so I don't have to warn you about the bell, because we do want a conversation after the initial remarks are done. So we're going to go to Mr. Shekhar Bonu now. Over to you.
Thank you. So before I start, I would like to once again congratulate the authors for the outstanding job. See, I'm not a economist, and I have a medical background. So, but I'm still very, very curious about economics and finance. So I keep reading, and where this book really stands out, it's so easy to read. It's not at all intimidating. There's not much jargon, and it's extremely well researched, and it has such large key references at the end. And the best part is, I think both Ajay and Salman are geniuses. I hope a lot more books are going to come from their desk. Is such complex topics, connecting the dots, and also making sense at the micro level, but also making sense at the macro level. For example, MG Narega, the type of narration they have while supporting it, but also highlighting the limitations. So it's fun to read, and it is one of those few books which I've actually completed. So congratulations. The great part, is very forward-looking. So one paragraph which I particularly really liked is, we hope, quote, we hope these ideas in our book, Unshackling India, will not only generate interest and discussion in the best tradition of argumentative Indians, but also spur action and a thrust forward to achieve India's destiny in the world in this century. And they lay out clear pathways for next 25 years, the aspirations and so forth. I mean, there are lots of, some parts of it you might agree, you might not agree, but it's a perspective told in a very, very compelling manner. I'm also one of the bureaucrats, so it's not that I sit in NITI Aayog, I sit in many of these brainstorming meetings. It's not that these issues are not discussed. Many of these solutions are also thought through, the analysis. Probably I'll stick to what I've seen over my 30 odd years of civil servant career. what makes logically correct, economically correct, somehow it doesn't go through. So there are things through which these have to navigate, which we broadly call it as political economy, where all the complex gender-based inequalities, caste, religion, and you add another layer of interest groups, and then weak institutions all interplay, which makes it very, very complex. How do you take these solutions which look so elegant, translate into action for the type of goals or outcomes we want to achieve? I mean, it's very simple. You raise passenger tariff so that you don't need to cross-subsidize freight. And freight is cross-subsidized. Actually, the power consumers in Punjab cross-subsidize passenger tariff in railways. That's the logic. And but who is going to do it, and at what cost? And in a competitive political economy like India, where you just have 5 years, and the huge amount of capital, electoral capital that you have to spend. Likewise, you have power tariffs, you have huge amount of subsidies. It's not that there are a lot of smart people in the government who understand, but how do we handle this political economy challenges? I think there's a lot more need to shift our research into this world of how to get these things done in a context of the political, so-called political economy. And I think this is where sciences are not strong enough. The behavioral economics part, the institutional economics part, they are not as simple as demand, supply, and other parts of the economy, but still they have a important implication. Unless until we figure it out, how do we navigate in this complex context? So, there are some, I think where government has done very well is to free the economy. Let the markets operate. That part is probably easier, and maybe there's some parts to do. But where the markets have failed, where the state has to take a major role, how can it motivate its providers? What type of models, efficient models we can come up with? We find these challenges even in US. They spend a huge amount of money on their healthcare. What are the types of outcomes that we see there? Still around large number of their disadvantaged groups don't have health insurance. So I think the whole different parts of the world are confronting with different types of challenges. My call would be that we know reasonably well about what will work, but solutions. But where I think we need to focus and have a lot more research and understanding is how can you take them through this black box of so-called political economy or the context and get the outcomes delivered. It's not enough to let your frustration out on some government and have someone to blame. The truth is, I think everyone is keen to deliver it, but how do you navigate it? And recent whole agriculture reforms and the way some powerful farmers expecting that the next would be withdrawal of minimum support prices have stalled the whole reform process. Yeah, you can say that we could have done a slightly better job, but the government is confronted with a situation where it has to deal with interest groups, very, very strong interest groups, and those people whom it wants to support, most of them are voiceless. So it's a sort of a very complex game. I don't want to take too much of my time, but the point I am saying is that there is need. We know, I think the book has done a great job. I hope the next round of book would be to unravel this black box and tell us how to handle these complex contexts and get results. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shekhar. So we have 3 more panelists, but please, don't keep saying, "Arey, the authors have to write another book." So we can discuss the action plan later. Let's say in the middle, if not toward the end of the session, we have to give the authors some silver bullets. That's the purpose of these sessions. Be reckless a little bit. It's okay, I think. We won't be held. We will. It's always I think it was Mr. Shekhar who said that I'm not quite an economist, but everybody feels like they're economists, sir. And actually, we know what is to be done. We know why things are bad, or we know what is to be done. And often the discussion gets stuck at how it apparently Mr. Vajpayee, after a very grand presentation by McKinsey about 10% growth, after like a long extended session, उनका एक famous line था, पर ये सब होगा कैसे? How? So the what के बाद how is something very important. So I think the book has some how tips on how. Anyway, we're going to go to the next panelist, Ms. Mahua Mukherjee. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the authors. I really enjoyed a number of chapters, including the state capability. I loved the financial whodunit because I've lived through that, the financial whodunit in the power sector. So that brought me joy. The human capital one really opened my eyes, the way you connected the dots with the malnourished, as Salman very eloquently spoke about at the beginning of today's session. I'm not going to use my precious minutes to talk about what I loved, because I loved everything about the book. And I'm just going to dive into where I think we can go a little bit deeper. And that is on the clean energy transition and the creation of green jobs. Because I think that pretty much already people are starting to get disillusioned that the clean energy transition is bringing jobs of the high-end variety, of the very white-collar variety, in terms of designing solar plants, wind farms, and so on. And the inclusivity aspect is not really there, or hasn't been uncovered yet, because essentially you just need the manual labor at the time of putting up the plant. Then there's no fuel, and the plant runs itself basically for the next 25 years. So people are saying, where are my jobs? Where are the unskilled jobs, which are going to be displaced from coal and from other things? So what we saw in the latest budget is that, again, the government of India has done a really what I think is a very good thing, which is to allocate some incentive funds, production-linked incentives, to get India plugged into the global value chain at the highest levels, in all sorts of very top-end, high-efficiency solar panels, semiconductor fabrication, numerous, 5G ecosystem, and so on. These are really great, and they must be done. And but these once again will give jobs to the very highly skilled and qualified people. So I appreciate both my previous speakers, Nisha and Mr. Shekhar, for having already kind of highlighted some of the things that I also want to talk about, which is the inclusiveness, the gender aspect, and also the idea of how do we solve and the political economy conundrum that bureaucrats always cite. And the thing is that the voiceless, somehow the government tries to, in our view, we who are not in that fraternity, we see that the government kind of turns away when there are actually quite easy ways. And I want to give 3 or 4 of them, which are happening, so that India should, in my view, expand the notion of what is the green jobs possibility in the clean energy transition. It needs to do a show and tell, and then it needs to show the world and be a role model for many other developing countries who have a similar problem of so many people with limited skills who need jobs. So let me start with the first one, which is that we have a unique opportunity, which is also part of our clean energy transition, and the global one actually, which is to use natural products to manufacture disposable items like bamboo cutlery, areca leaf nut disposable plates. We have coconut leaf straws. These are, disposable plates, straws, plastic cutlery, all these things are posing huge problems, and there's an entirely global demand for them. We have startups in India that are actually making some very good things and that are exporting them to very few places, but they need help. And unfortunately, they also need state help in the form of standards, protection of their designs, their products. They need branding, this kind of thing. I know this is anathema probably to the authors, which say that the state should be getting out of things rather than into things. But at least in order to set up the contours of these markets, we do need some state support. And the state, as usual, would just ignore all these startups which are starved for capital. They could produce wonderful, massive things on Brand India kind of name. They are using rural women, by the way. Their products are produced entirely in rural areas. You'll be amazed if you see these coconut leaf straws and pens and all sorts of things, bamboo cutlery, as I already mentioned, but they have no help. They're essentially just on their own. The formal credit sector won't touch them. They can only borrow from money lenders. So I think this is a huge opportunity that the government is going to miss if it doesn't expand its notion of the clean energy transition and look at the global market. So new natural products is number one. Number two is that we have a unique thing in India, which is business models for light EVs. I know Niti Aayog is very much leading on the two-wheeler and three-wheeler electric vehicle transition. India has come up with a battery swapping model, which nowhere else has, and has operationalized it. So it lowers the cost of getting into the EV sector if you can buy just the chassis and not the battery. So this is, and you can rent the battery. You basically buy the body and you rent the battery. And we have mobile app software which allows you to find the nearest battery swapping station. It's about a 7-kilo battery for a two-wheeler. So you just lift it out, give it, take a fully charged one across the counter. This is unique. I've written about it in my, I've written about it, and anybody who reads this loves it. No, it's not being done anywhere, and this should be exported throughout the developing world, this business model. I could say more, but let me just jump straight to my third one, which I think India can expand its clean energy transition notion, which is another unique thing that's happening in Delhi. Because of the regulation that cars over 10 years old on petrol or diesel cars cannot be on the road anymore, there's a unique industry that has sprung up, which is conversion of these cars to battery operated ones. Nobody has heard that. Everybody thinks it's very cool. A lot of people have told me that India can actually export this service to the world. Some of us remember about 20 years ago, people used to pop up abroad offering to tailor your suits overnight. And that's sort of a service skill. Instead of that, people can say, I will convert your car to a battery operated car in 4 hours. And I will, in India, the price is $5,500 US, so 4 lakh rupees, which is far less than the cost of buying a new EV. And let me move on to my final one, which is a land use change. I think somebody on this today's event already mentioned land use change. We cannot afford to have as much land as we need for the amount of solar panels that we have talked about. We have a target of 280 gigawatts. Now, 2 gigawatts in Karnataka is taking up 13,000 acres. And this is like 56 square kilometers that is fenced off. People didn't realize that they wouldn't have access to their land once they leased it. But we just can't do it. So agrivoltaics, this is my last point. Agrivoltaics is some German R&D, which is showing that the soil benefits and the solar generation is higher when you combine land, you have a land use change, and you actually plant crops below the solar panels and in between the rows of the solar panels, because the transpiration of the plant cools down the power electronics on the backside of the solar panel. So we just don't have a way in our country, just following some of Salman's hard truths, to get rich people and poor people to work together. Just to, take one more step beyond what Nisha was saying. If they're in the same space and they're earning their money from the same space, we don't seem to have ways of making people comfortable with that. So if you have very wealthy solar park investors, they are uncomfortable and they want to just think of putting fences and not letting the farmers there. So we need some regulations. So I will conclude by saying, yes, I agree with the authors that the government needs to get out of a lot of things, but it also needs to get into some things through standards, through regulations, through mandating things. In the case of the batteries, by the way, it needs to mandate interoperability of batteries so that you can switch batteries across different EVs that have been made in India. Similarly here, it needs to say, sorry, any new solar park has to be an agrivoltaic park, or you can't just have the land all to yourself and kick off the farmers. I'll stop here before I run out of time. So thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Mawat. So we have given three very, very specific ideas and actionable ideas. I didn't know that India was the only or one of the very few countries which actually have a national battery swapping policy. Because I'm told that the battery life is actually 10 years, whereas the car life may be 4 or 5 years. I mean, the battery life is more than twice. So they actually have a market value. So it makes sense to have a battery swapping policy because they last much longer. Okay. Let's go to the next panelist, Mr. Alok Ranjan. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Ajay. Thank you very much. And let me begin by complimenting the authors, Mr. Salman Anisoz and Dr. Ajay Chiber, on writing a wonderful book, Unshackling India. As I have not met Mr. Salman Anisoz earlier, but I was very happy to hear his comments today and the way he has articulated his viewpoint in the book also. And of course, I must share with you that Ajay Chiber I know very well, since both of us studied together in the Economics Honors in St. Stephen's. And of course, we were in the residence together on the same Mukherjee West Block. As it so happened, he was one of our brightest stars out there in economics. I do remember that. And even though I moved away, I went and did my MBA from IIM Ahmedabad and then got into the IAS. He went to D school and then abroad and PhD and everything in World Bank. And at that time also, I remember we always knew that Ajay would go into academics because he was so conceptual all the time, so clear about his views and so absorbed in whatever he was studying. I always, even at that time, remember, I had a hunch that he'll find a career in academics, and he's done so, and has done so well for himself. Regarding the book, I must say one thing, that normally I've read a lot of books by economists, and normally they end up by having a kind of a negative approach by saying that this is wrong, that is wrong, this is not doing okay, this policy has not worked, and they'll also say at the end of it, but they don't come out with a real solution really, It's more diagnostic than anything else. And being an administrator and having worked in the field for 38 years, I know it's very easy to find what is wrong and what are the problems and diagnose. But the most difficult part is to find what is the solution and what will work and how it will work, when it will work, which way we should go about, what should be the roadmap. And I was happy about this book mainly because they have focused on the roadmap. Every chapter, various chapters on various, whether it is clean energy transition, whether it's about women participation, whether it is education, whether it is health, whether it is inclusive development, they have come out with a roadmap. So that I think was one, and in that roadmap, they have highlighted all the issues which are under discussion and possibly suggested what could be the best alternative. So that way I was very happy with the book because it's more, prescient about what is going to happen in the future and a roadmap for the next 25 years as we laid down in this. The theme, of course, is reducing the scope and reach of the state, as the Unshackling India says, and improving its capability, enhancing its capability or competence. Well, there are different views on these issues also at times, but all said and done, I think we must and we have to agree on this fact that somehow what the Honorable Prime Minister of India also once said, that he wants to have minimum government and maximum governance. I think that is the right approach, though of course it's a matter of debate how far he has been able to achieve that because of different constraints which have come up from time to time maybe. But yes, I think this is what Unshackling India is all about, because I also wondered what is being unshackled, like Ajit said in the beginning. And that I realized that he is trying to say that somehow the state is become, all encompassing. It has, outreached itself, gone into areas where it should not have gone into every aspect of human life, which it should not have done so. So I think this is what the whole idea, the whole philosophy of this book is. And I think one has no option but to agree with that, because that is definitely the way forward. Now, India is, of course, plagued by the questions which have been attended to in this book, the issue of an inclusive economy, having a roadmap for growth, which includes the poorest of the poor. Having worked in the rural areas, in particular as an administrator, I find the problems of poverty, the issues of agriculture, really issues which are very, very important and should concern not only every economist, but every person or every citizen of this country. When we talk of equality, for instance, or inequality, like many of my predecessors have spoken, now inequality as an economic concept is one thing, that the top so many percentage, having so much percent of the income, the bottom only so many. But when I go to the villages, when I go to the rural areas during my job, I found the sense of hopelessness sometimes when you see in the eyes of the people, they are not getting education beyond class 10 or class 12. Even the kind of education they're getting is not of the right quality. The worst thing is there is no hope there. They're not aspiring for anything. How can you think of a developed India, or how can you think of an India 2047 or take it forward or becoming the 21st century, become the Indian century, if there's a vast majority of our youth, boys and girls, are living in this kind of a situation where they're not getting the right education, not getting the right health care, not getting the right nutrition. The highest percentage of stunting in the world is there in India, especially on the state I come from, Uttar Pradesh. 37% of children are stunted. That kind of, more than 40% are malnourished. What kind of an India then are we going to build up on this basis is a question I think is very important. So when you talk of a roadmap, we have to take these factors into account. So state cannot be fully done away with, is what I want to say is. There is a role where the state definitely, and the authors have also said that. Let the state focus on what they can do best and enhance their capability. I think the state has to intervene in favor of the poor, of the marginalized, and bring them up to that level. I think this is very, very important. Healthcare and education are two issues which are my favorite topics. And I, as an administrator, also I tried to focus on that. Somehow, politically, they have never been so important. I don't know why. If you see, even in UP these days, the election campaign is going on. Various issues are being talked of, but very few people, despite the pandemic, are talking of health and education. As you know, despite the issue of unemployment has been raised time and again, that there is a lot of unemployment. But how do you get over the unemployment? Well, it's all right. You create government jobs and have, but that's not the answer ultimately. What kind of an economic setup do you have which will create jobs, which will lead to, how much industrialization, what kind of industrialization, how much of the benefit we'll get from the tourism sector or from other sectors where you can bring jobs. There's a huge demographic dividend which we have to cater to. We have in Uttar Pradesh, for instance, my state, like in India, maximum number of people are in this age group 20 to 45. Highest percentage is there in our state. And that is why today, it has become a biggest issue as far as the youth is concerned. So what are the solutions for that? How do we solve that? And I said that, okay, infrastructure is all right, physical infrastructure, develop roads, develop irrigation, develop power, but focus on the human capital is why I feel very strongly. We must focus on the human capital. Look at healthcare. The whole thing got exposed during the pandemic, completely got exposed, We saw that in the beginning that we just did not have enough ICUs. We did not have enough, doctors. We did not have enough nurses. We did not have enough paramedics. We did not have even oxygen. How to attend to the problem that was being faced by people during the pandemic? Of course, to a certain extent, we did handle the pandemic as well as we could. But then the second wave, of course, was not handled so well, despite the effort made by so many doctors and so many administrators. But then, of course, the vaccination is a success story. So that at least showed that how the administrators can bring about a change or can handle the program well as they handle the vaccination program. Maybe that spirit has to be brought into other aspects of healthcare also. Right from the time I joined service in 1978, we've been talking about those health PHCs, the health centers at the block level or the village level not being functional, doctors being absent, doctors not reporting for duty, shortage of doctors, shortage of nurses. The same problems are continuing today, despite so many years having passed by. So I think very, very concrete steps have to be taken in this direction. We have to have more doctors. As the Prime Minister also said recently, we have to have many more medical colleges. We have to, but then what is the quality of the medical college? What is the quality of the medical education that we are imparting? In Uttar Pradesh, we are setting up hospitals in every district, but then we don't have doctors out there. We don't have teachers out there. What kind of education will they impart? The standard of the hospital in which they are working is not of that level. So I, being an administrator, look at the implementation issues and I find that despite everything, a lot needs to be done as far as implementation is concerned. Of course, as far as healthcare is concerned, we have to raise our expenditure from 1.3% of GDP where it stands today to 2.5% as fast as possible and even take it beyond. But then states like UP and Bihar, there is a huge problem absorption of that expenditure. So that has, the systemic changes that we brought about, the governance system has to be, modernized, technology has to be brought into the system. Corruption has to be done away with if you really want to see that whatever funds are allocated reach the intended beneficiary. Similarly, with education, I just quickly go through, just a couple of minutes left, I'm noticing. Education is also very important. Again, in the practical side, I notice, despite the new education policy, which I think has a very far-sighted document, it has talked about a lot of issues, about foundational literacy, about some of the earlier speakers talked about Anganwadi workers and how Anganwadi workers can impart foundational literacy. Then the ASA report was mentioned also, how a class 5 student cannot read class 2 text. This is the reality. More than that are issues, the teachers are not teaching. Teacher, as the book points out, the fulcrum is the teacher. The most important thing is to improve the quality of the teacher, recruit the best teachers, train them, equip them, and make them teach and have an education governance system which makes the teachers teach. But somehow in UP, at least what my experience has been, the huge amount of teacher absenteeism, despite the good salary that many of the government teachers are getting. Why is this happening? What are the issues? These need to be tackled at the ground level on a very serious note if we want to improve the quality of education. The learning outcomes need to be measured, because otherwise what we are churning out of people, whole lot of people who have done class 10, class 12 or even graduation, but they have not got any real education, have not learned anything really, so they become unemployable. And if they're unemployable, then what they don't able to add in any way, either to the political development of the country, economic development or social development, they are not part of the participative process at all. So that I think is very, very important that we focus on the quality of education from the primary level right up to the higher or technical level. And we have to develop institutes of excellence today. Today we have IITs, we have IIMs, we have institutes of excellence, but how many of them are there? We need many more. And if we need many more, imagine the kind of expenditure that is required in the area of higher and technical education. Where will we get the kind of resources for that? How will we invest in that? These all issues are very important. Finally, I think I would not like to take too much time, but I found in this book, he has spoken of the South Korean experience, how they focused on healthcare, and that was the basis upon which they built up their economy later on. Maybe we also, I think, have to focus on social capital, human capital, develop our human capital and build upon that, and then talk of lasting or sustainable growth. About policy making, just one word. There was mentioned by some of the speakers earlier. I think policy making has to involve all the stakeholders, especially the poorest person available, to know what he really needs, then come out with policies. Otherwise, policies fail, not because of any other reason, but because they're not attending to the real issues which are prevalent in the economy. If they do that, then they will certainly be successful. They can be implemented better. The case of the farm laws is there. I was a supporter of the farm laws because I thought the agriculture sector needed structural reforms. But the process of introducing them was not participatory. If they were not participatory, then they were not able to communicate what they wanted. And the farmers felt that this was against them. And they thought that their main issues have not been attended to. Maybe if they had been involved in the whole process, the much better solution could have come about. And finally, I'll say that one last, just as I finish, one last question I'll have for all the panelists. Also, I think I like them to answer, which is troubling me a lot. I am reading everywhere that manufacturing now is no longer leading to kind of employment that is required. And we require employment. And in UP, for my state, we want the industrialization of UP. So somewhere I read Azim Premji report that in 1994, if you invested 1 crore, you employed 33 people. Today, if you're investing 1 crore, you employ only 8 people. The employment elasticity has gone down like anything from 0.25 to 0.1. If that is so, then if we go in for manufacturing and manufacturing is not going to lead to jobs, then what is the option? How do we generate jobs? And if we don't go into manufacturing, we will not shift people from non-farm to farm occupations. If we don't do that, then the per capita income is not going to go up. The GDP is not going to go up. This is a conundrum which is there in my mind. And I would like to panelists also during the discussion to think about it. And finally, I will end by saying that what I liked really about the book, and I think that is what the spirit should be, that we have to think about the future, about our children, about the others who are coming after us. We have to leave a better country for those who come after us. I think that is the essence of this book. They have tried to focus on that, and I must really compliment the author for doing that. And yes, we are responsible for what we leave behind for the future generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Alok Ranjan. I hope the authors are taking notes, because there's been a it's like a gushing ideas, and feeling like standing under the Niagara Falls, trying to catch the ideas in a bucket. But I think, let me remind you that the session is going to be recorded, so you can go over it slowly. But thank you, Mr. Alok Ranjan. Lots of ideas from, as you said, somebody who's been in the field for 38 years. And good to know that your life began at St. Stephen's. Many good ideas, I think, began at St. Stephen's. Anyway, I think, because time, thoda sa, so let me quickly go to the next panelist, and then we'll come back with questions and discussion. So over to you. By the way, our next panelist, Pooja Mehra, also has written a really great book. It's called The Lost Decade. And it's, I think, if I'm not wrong, this is about the decade from roughly 2008 to 18 or something like that, or 10. And it's very, very, very vividly captured and very good narrative. So as Mr. Alokan was saying, economists are good at diagnosing what happened. So I'm not going to put the blame on Pooja, but it's a great read. Sometimes that's what tells you actually what needs to be done as well. So diagnosis is important. Okay, over to you, Pooja. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ranade, and thank you to the authors for asking me to speak on the discussion, and thank you to SKOCH and the organizers. My many congratulations to both the authors. And part of the problem when you're the last person to speak on the panel is that almost everything that you would like to say has been said by the previous panelists. Having said that, Unshackling India is an optimistic book. I have, as Dr. Ranade just said, written a slightly pessimistic book. My book is about, how we do not take the decisions. Our country and decision makers do not take the decisions that need to be taken. And so this book is about unshackling India, but my view is that India just refuses to be unshackled. And I would talk about what they have written in terms of questions that they have raised. And try and avoid repeating what has already been said by the previous panelists about the book before me. The book starts by talking about the role of the government and whether we need a big government or a small government. And what they say is that we need to reorient the role of the government. We need more health and education. We want less of government running Air India and business. We want more safety net. So I think what that leads us to is to ask that if we want and what they've described, if we want to reorient the role of the government, then how do we exit these companies that Government of India owns and how their performance has not been up to the mark? And I think I really like that analysis, how they've described return on these investments have not been good. What I like the most is that how it links with other parts of the problem in the economy and other chapters where they say part of the reason of having a big government and having all these PSUs was also employment creation. So part of the reason I think that privatization has not happened is because it threatens jobs. And if, like they also say, the problem with the growth model is that it does not produce jobs, or it produces jobless growth, then I think there's a conflict over there between privatization, the role of the state, and job creation. And I'd like to say that, whereas, yes, the book covers a lot of hard truths, I'd like to ask, are the choices really clear? When there are these kind of conflicts between the need to do privatization, whereas government not being able to do privatization. We saw in the case of Air India for 20 years, or now in the case of public sector banks, but because the employees of public sector units are obviously going to oppose. The other thing, the other question that I liked that they raise is, about what kind of growth? Is it going to be manufacturing-led growth or services-led growth? Where the labor market needs to be looked at all over again for us to see what happens, because there's a lot of automation happening around the world. And the panelists before me also raised this question of how, although our advantage seems to be labor, low-cost labor, but a lot of our manufacturing is actually very capital intensive. And so what that means in terms of labor policy, what that means in terms of what are the areas where we need to create jobs so that we'll absorb the labor, which were not going to get automated that easily. That was an important question I thought that was raised in the book. The other thing is there are a couple of questions actually that I wanted to raise for the authors. One is that their source of optimism. What is their source of optimism, which leads them to believe that a lot of these decisions and choices could be made? Because, like somebody said before me, also we are not seeing any narrative around health and education, particularly in a year like this, where because of the pandemic, both of these issues and problems related to them were pretty much in focus. And yet we don't see any backlash from voters or even in the general discourse on these topics. So how do we know that all of these choices will get made? What can be done to push policymakers and decision makers to make these choices and make use of recommendations, these excellent recommendations in the book. Related to this also is that I feel that a lot of reforms that have taken place after 1991 are sort of being reversed, such as in the area of trade, such as the PLI scheme, which is you're giving subsidies to large companies. It's like the fertilizer subsidy. We talk about reforming subsidies in other areas. So are we sort of regressing on the whole direction in which we thought policy would move after 1991? Even decisions that were taken by this government in the financial sector, for instance, the insolvency-related decisions, reforms, that are getting diluted. We are not seeing them the way they were originally conceptualized. So that's the other thing that I wanted to ask, because I thought that's relevant to the discussion of the various issues in the book, because if decisions get taken and a few years later they get reversed, then probably that's why we're stubbornly stuck where we are stuck. So how do we break out of that? That's one set of sort of discussions and recommendations that we need. And finally, before me, we talked about, one of the panelists talked about taxation and the stagnant tax to GDP ratio, which doesn't budge. So are we stuck in a sequence problem where incomes don't quickly increase, and therefore you cannot raise taxes, but you want to depend on taxes as a way of creating jobs, and so you keep going into that loop again and again. So is there a need to sort of revisit that? Yeah, I think for now that's what I wanted to say. Maybe in the second round I'll come back with more.
Okay, thank you, Pooja. So we do have a time management problem. So for this next phase, I'm going to request everybody to be very brief in their answers. So this is like a rapid fire round. So the authors, please bear with us. Let me just shoot one question at Ajay. How do you react to Nisha's suggestion that we tax? We're not doing enough on taxation. Do you support it?
So thank you. Yeah, no, just on the tax issue, just to say that, yes, we have to tackle inequality, but some of the suggestions she made, wealth tax, it has not worked very practically in many countries. The corporate tax, we can debate that, but let me come to the what's in the book. In the book, we say two things. One, we say the GST needs to be fixed. So, because the GST in our experience around the world, many countries that have tried some form of GST or VAT, we have seen an increase in tax GDP ratio of at least 3-4%, and we are not seeing that as yet in India. And part of that is because of the nature. The other one is property tax, which we mention very prominently in the book, that India has a very low property tax. And that also is a tax that can go to the lowest level of government. And that's an area where I think a push has to be made. But I'm not going to answer the broader question on inequality, but if you like, we can go there. But let me stop since you're running.
So you think the GST is actually an underutilized, has potential. So Salman, and property tax, but we can discuss property later. But okay, Salman, there was an observation I think by Mr. Alok Ranjan and maybe by Pooja as well, implicitly by Pooja, that in the campaigning, we don't see any discussion of health or malnutrition or jobs. It's all about something else completely. Maybe it's about temples and statues and God knows what else. So it looks like the electorate is not interested in development. I mean, how does one understand this, and how do we take? I think Pooja was saying that maybe people don't want change. I mean, I'm putting it provocatively, but do you see this puzzle that electoral campaigns never seem to mention developmental issues?
Well, first of all, let me just say that there is reason for optimism in the following kind of context. For the longest time, when we used to discuss the economy, we would not really discuss, even economists would not discuss health and education and women and social. This was not, Amartya Sen has been talking about it for ages, but nobody would talk about it. Now we're in a discussion where this is mainstreamed, as in people who are, I think, those who you might call influential, they will readily admit health and education are fundamental. Let me now get to the political part. I was just watching a show on the Uttar Pradesh election, and there were young students. I think they were at a law school, all boys or young men, and the interviewers were asking them about issues that were close to their hearts, and they unanimously said that for us, jobs are the most critical things. Yes, we don't see this covered in the media, but that's what really bothers us. But fundamentally, education is what should be driving this, and health should be driving this. Now, when those young people who are supposedly law grads or soon to be law grads said this, of course, I was very happy to hear this. It was unexpected for me that they would basically say education and health are important. They made it a point to say that, we should be learning from the Kerala model. They were not at all happy with the chief minister's remarks that maybe Kerala has to learn from Uttar Pradesh, for example, because we know human capital outcomes in Kerala are much better, not just against UP, but pretty much across the country.
So are you saying?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but are you saying that you were enthused by the fact that in UP elections the youth were asking for jobs and maybe health and education? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I mean, look. I do not believe at all, or maybe that's my sunny side. That I don't believe that people will disregard these kinds of issues forever, because it hits people. And I think the fact that we are talking about health and education, people like us are talking about health and education in the context of economic reforms, and then young people and others who are dealing with this on a regular basis, this moment will change. I think this time will come when people will be focused a lot more on these issues.
Okay, so let me toss that back to Ajay. And with the permission of panelists, we're going to do this a little bit with the authors for the timing. See, Ajay, you talked about jobs, and in fact, you talked about UP. There was this recent, recent job fair or something where there was a couple of hundred government jobs where there was a recruitment drive, and some 1 crore, 10 million people showed up. So when these youth are saying that we want jobs, I think what they're implicit, because there are jobs, there's private sector, but really what they want is a government job. So we're still back to the basic puzzle that is the solution. And then there's, I think other panelists mentioned the threat of automation. Somebody said 1 crore investment is to generate 33 jobs. Now it generates 8 jobs only or something. So does the government need to create more jobs? Is that what
you know? I mean, the thing is that as we say in our book, it's not the government's job to create jobs. It's the government's job to help create the ecosystem which will lead to the creation of jobs in the private sector. The reason why you have all this hankering for government jobs, as we also show in our book, is that the government is paying too much. If you look very carefully at government jobs, because they are so much in the central government or at the state government level, you compare the salary scales now. I have people telling me that when they hire a young person, they are offering 15 or 20,000 rupees. My driver, when I was in the government, was being paid the total sum benefit of close to 35,000, 40,000 rupees if you take the salary plus all the other benefits together. So the hankering for the few government jobs is also because there aren't enough well-paying private sector jobs out there. And I think that's where the light manufacturing that we missed out on completely, that you see in Bangladesh. You see a huge increase in the female labor force participation rate in Bangladesh because you have all these women that are coming from villages with the same social structure and the same social problems that we have. You see a huge improvement there. You see it in Cambodia, you see it in Vietnam in droves. So I think that's where we need to focus on as to why haven't we and why are we deindustrializing, and why is the actually employment now in the agriculture sector increasing, which is partly related to all this also. Also, just to answer one quick question on Pooja's point that, we did a full analysis of all the companies that were privatized when the BJP, when the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government was there. Arun Shourie did the privatization. So we had analyzed all those companies, including Maruti. And you see, you don't lose jobs. You may not have the same people working, but actually where Maruti was and where Maruti is today is just a whole different world altogether, right? So privatization doesn't mean you will lose jobs overall. You will have different jobs. You will have, in fact, probably far more jobs.
So this is always the promise, Ajay, without sounding a little pessimistic, they always say India has a great future and shall always be so. So, this is always, when are we going to realize that potential? So on that count, Mahua Mukherjee had very specific, you said labor intensive stuff. She had very specific suggestions, for example, on the bamboo based industry. Is that something that we should pursue? But that again, that government has to play a role there.
Well, I think certain areas we do say, like health, education, and particularly climate-related activities. Climate change is the mother of all market failures, right? So I think those are areas where the government should perhaps pay more focus on. Now, on the very specific thing that she talked about, I'm not an expert in bamboo manufacturing and those sorts of things or photovoltaic cells to be able to know. But the broad point that she's trying to make is that it is in agrivoltaic. But the broad point she's making that this is an area where the state must pay more attention is the right one. And it shouldn't go into nitpicky details on, whether it should be this particular type of battery or that particular type of agrivoltaic cell. I think those are choices that I think now technology in the renewable has come to a point where the cost of renewable has gone down sufficiently that you don't need very heavy subsidies, but you do. So you need a guiding hand a little bit more than a very heavy intervening hand in that area.
Yeah. So, I don't know, maybe we should have, because we are running out of time, can I just request each panelist to make a 1-minute remark in the same sequence? Because I like the forceful thing what Nisha said. I'm tempted to, ask her questions, but we don't have time. That she said we need to tax more, we need But on one hand, this whole focus on trying to get the free and the private sector going, they'll say that India is already taxed too much. 42% is the marginal rate, and so on and so forth. So can I just say, can we just do it this way, that we'll just go around the table with just very brief second round remarks by the panelists, and then I'll give the floor back to the authors. So starting with you, Nisha.
I think just to go back to the point of taxation, yes, it's important to collect more from GST, but if you look at the share that India collects from direct taxes versus indirect, it's the opposite of what it should be. Indirect taxes are regressive, direct taxes can be made to be progressive. And the point that I'm making is that we are leaving behind a lot of tools on the table to make our overall tax system more progressive. Okay, I mean, I know that wealth tax is difficult to tax, but inheritance tax is a very common tax in many countries in the world. There is not a problem to say that when somebody dies, 30% or 40% of what they leave behind should go back to the state, so that within 2 or 3 generations, the wealth that has been collected goes back to society and new wealth can be generated rather than remaining in the same families over time. So I think hiding behind saying administratively direct taxes are somehow more complex administratively than indirect taxes, I just don't think it's true from international experience.
Okay. Mr. Shekhar Bonu?
Yeah, I think the government is going to play a critical role. If you look at the Nordic, Scandinavian countries, the role just keeps on increasing, whether you like it or not, given the planetary challenges and so forth. So I think building capacity of the state becomes very critical. I have few ideas. One, I think the type of complex development challenges that we are dealing with, we need a lot more experts. So I think the government should be open to get lateral interest in. So that way you can increase. Second, I think the government should be open to work with and build on external ecosystem, which includes think tanks, academia, private sector, civil society, and a lot more. And third, I think the government should have highly sophisticated procurement systems, so that instead of doing it everything itself, it should outsource, which includes public-private partnerships and so forth. So in doing these things, I think the government institutions can pivot from where they are to a much, much higher level to handle many of the things that the authors have discussed.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you. Ms. Mahua?
Yeah, thanks. I have one point which was flagged in the book, which I think is also another symptom of inequality in some way, which is this failure to protect the ecology while doing these large kind of environmental infrastructure projects. Because what happens in India is that a lot of environmental and forest clearances are taken in a conditional way, subject to restitution of whatever kinds, and those are never done. And because the project promoters are always good friends with the government, there's a huge amount of corruption, and that's an issue.
Those are backloaded. They're backloaded, so they come after 25 years. Yeah.
No, they never actually come. And meanwhile, the people are deprived, and the environmental damage just takes one overnight to be done. And the second thing I wanted to mention is that what would be really good is if somehow the government culture would change, so that bureaucrats would lose their aversion to having their performance, not their performance, the performance of the programs and the monies they're overseeing actually be evaluated systematically and rigorously. There's a huge aversion to being evaluated here. And that is what I think is needs to change. So accountability is missing. I think especially with the climate transition, we need a lot more accountability, because India will have to actually answer questions in the international forum. So we need to change that. Thanks.
Thank you. Alok Ranjan, can you just, can you also give us the prediction for UP election? No, I'm just kidding.
So for all said and done, yes, I would share with you that unemployment has become an issue in the UP elections, because as Mr. Salman pointed out, the youth are demanding it. So at least that's a good change. But then the other thing is also true, which came out, that there is all talk is about government jobs and not about creating the kind of ecosystem that will create jobs. We have to focus on that kind of ecosystem. And second, very quickly, I'll make a point is, Unshackling India, just a thought for everybody. I think being a bureaucrat and being there, I think the whole governance structure also needs to be unshackled. It is so shackled up in processes, in procedures, in rules, precedents, that decision making is not taking place at the speed at which it should. If this thing can be done, reforms can come about in the governance sector, what Baba Mukherjee also pointed out. There is accountability, there's performance linked to things, and there is outcome orientation. Then things will definitely change, and good governance by itself can make a big impact on the economic development. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, sometimes I wonder what to use. Is it Chekhov or Kafka or Solzhenitsyn or Tolstoy? The metaphors. So last comment from Pooja before we go back to the authors. So Pooja, I hope you don't have to write another book called The Second Lost Decade. So I'm going to put the spotlight on you and you have to make one. Yeah,
I'm hoping so. I really hope I don't have to write, the lost decades or something like that. But my point was more earlier, Dr. Chiber replied, my point was more that we are seeing that in the private sector, more capital-intensive manufacturing takes place. So therefore, the trust in public sector versus private sector creation of jobs, job security, demands on and accountability on performance, etc. I think that's why the youth would prefer any day for no privatization, for jobs to be in the to get jobs in the government sector rather than and public sector units rather than the private sector. And this is not just for low-paying, low-end jobs. I mean, when I speak to students in Stephens, right now, majority of them want to join the IAS. Majority of them want government jobs. Hardly anybody wants a private sector job. Same for D-School and same for other Delhi University colleges. And I wanted to introduce a slightly more immediate term point here, which is that, the book also says that depending on the decisions that are taken right now, India's post-pandemic growth trajectory could go in three different directions. It could either be 3 to 5% GDP growth, back to the 8% GDP growth, or less than that growth, 6 to 7% GDP growth. So, what are these different sets of decisions that need to be taken, on which will depend these different trajectories? If the authors could talk a little about that.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, I'm a journalist. I keep asking questions.
No, thank you. So I'm going to give it back to Ajay and Salman, but I'll just make a 1-minute comment and I'll request you to confine yourself to just 2 or 3 minutes because we're really out of time. I think, by the way, personally, I'm much more optimistic about this decade, and I'm sure Pooja will not have an occasion to write a second lost decade, because I think this is going to be quite a lot of capital spending, both public and private sector. This is going to be driven by things like as a lot of people you mentioned here about climate change related activities or renewable energy and so on. It's also going to be driven by digital, because the digital footprint, what we call the digital economy, that footprint is just going to keep expanding. And I believe, and then of course there's all these other China plus one factor, and there is the fact that we are reaching levels where the capacity utilizations are stretching. And so I'm actually quite optimistic that in the next few years, even though it may be 5 or 6%, but for a large base of $3 trillion, that's, we'll take that. We'll take 6%, even if we don't get 8%. So back to you, Ajay and Salman, and thanks for writing the book. After you, I think Dr. Gulshan can take over, but thank you again. So maybe 2 or 3 minutes max. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ajit. And I have a suggestion for SKOCH and for Samir, that they should have this session after the first draft of the book, because then the book will be so much better improved by the time it finally comes out. So thank you so much for the wonderful suggestions and the way you have chaired it, Ajit. We have learned so much from this. Just a few things I'll just say. One is, I'm on taxation. Nisha, I'm with you on direct taxation. I think we need to widen the base there quite a lot. Inheritance tax is a good idea. Property tax is a very much a direct tax, and it's very much there as well. But there's also a lot of sort of, exemptions that are given that we need to, loopholes and exemptions that we can address. So I do think a direct tax reform is needed, but I'm not in favor of, we had very heavy wealth taxes and very high income taxes in the past, and it didn't really help us very much. So I'm not very much in favor of that. Then on this issue of, just quickly on this issue of the various scenarios, let me just say, well, one, on the issue of subsidies, we're not against subsidies. We are in favor of subsidies. But we are saying there's a smarter way to do subsidies. We are very much focused on product-based subsidies, subsidy on fertilizer, subsidy on ticket for passenger rail, or whatever the subsidies, electricity subsidy by electricity pricing was. We're saying unshackle all that. Do give subsidies, but make it people-based subsidies. Especially now with DBT, etc. We have the capacity to be able to do that, and we have the means to be able to do that. So we should stop interfering in MSP and various types of, product-based tinkering with prices that we keep doing, and shift as most middle-income countries are shifting to people-based subsidies, direct income transfers, cash conditional transfers, etc. That's the direction that the government has been going for some time, but we need much more of that. That's what we are saying. On the scenarios, I am also optimistic, like you, Ajit. I do feel that, we had gone into a huge slump even before the pandemic. We had reached what our old professor Raj Krishna at D school used to call the Hindu growth rate of 3-4%. But how we will come out of that, perhaps we will go a little better than that, maybe 5%, but we should be, but 5% is not going to solve our problems. We need to be growing at 7-8%. And to create the less of the capital intensive industry, I was chief economic advisor to FICCI, as you know, for some time, Ajit. And there I won't name the person. I asked a businessman, I said, when you invest, you're always investing in these very capital intensive. He says, Ajay, we have adjusted to the labor laws of this country. We either do very capital intensive or we do, what we call casual labor. Because setting up plants that have to deal with our labor laws is not very easy to do. So we have to address some of those fundamental things that we point out in the book, that the labor laws, even after the reforms, are still very complicated. And I'm not an expert, but you can read all these Mahesh Vyas and all these people, they talk about it all the time. So I do think that that we do need to fix some of these factors of production. We have a floor area ratio, which is you talked about land use in photovoltaic cells, but look at our cities. We have the lowest floor area ratios in the world. And that's a regulation. That's why our land use in the urban area is so mismanaged. So there are lots of these issues, but I do feel that some more fundamental reform is needed to get to that 7-8%. Otherwise, we will be drifting along at 4-5% for some time. Let me stop.
Thank you. Salman, you want a minute or?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been, I think this has been the most informative kind of discussion we've had during the course of these last few months. These questions of taxation, and I fully agree that, we have a more aggressive tax system in India. It has to become more progressive, no doubt about it. These issues of political economy and how do you actually get the politicians to do this stuff? These are important questions. A very rich discussion on the energy sector and the green transition. Of course, these questions about how do you
want to talk about procurement?
Oh, no. I just wanted to briefly regarding the.
We'll talk tomorrow.
So
procurement.
Then these questions about when you privatize, how do you privatize? Air India took so much time, and actually we do talk about the appropriate way to privatize. Not that we should not privatize, but there's an appropriate way how to use those funds. My sense is sometimes that people feel that we should reduce the deficit using privatization proceeds, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. But obviously we don't have time to discuss all that right now. I do think that we did not address a fundamental issue, and that is our decentralization. When we talk about government, we always talk about government in the singular, as if we're talking about the central government. We should be talking about governments and all the way to the local levels. India's future, just as I emphasize women, the other strand is decentralization, and all the way to the local levels, empowered local authorities. And we have to work towards, help them get the capacity that they need. If we do not do these two things, my fear is, of course, health education, you have to focus on those things, and social protection. But if you do not focus on women, if you do not focus on decentralized governance, those are the two critical reforms. I don't see India at 5%. Forget 8%. I don't. And India must grow at 8%, at least. India has the potential to grow at 8%. I don't think we should be satisfied with 5%. But we have to make some fundamental changes. And the political class has a big role to play there. It is their political economy. But I can tell you from personal experience, working in Baramulla as an MLA candidate, I spoke only about health and education, did not promise a single job, and I was competitive in the bastions of the People's Democratic Party and the National Conference. I was from the Congress, and I was competitive. Only talked about health and education, and people listened. People listened. You have to have a conversation. We're not having the right conversation in the country. I hope we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Samir, back. It's over to you. It's a wrap up now. Samir and Rohan and Dr. Gurcharan.
Well, thank you very much. It has been such a pleasure, and we already 11 minutes over. But that's the track record we have for every book. Panel, thank you very much for being here. And I am looking forward to this book going on and winning the SKOCH LITFest Award for economics. That announcement would come soon. The India Economic Forum is on 26th of March at India Habitat Center. So do block your diaries for that. See you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.